and environmental planning. And so I have been working in the landscape industry for 40 years now. And in addition to that, I'm a permaculture designer and certified irrigation designer. And I was an arborist at one point in time. So I come with a very broad landscaping background. And I have, during these past 10 years, really delved into some of the topics such as pollinator gardening and soils, etc. So anyway, so last class we covered in depth soils, because soils are the very first line that you want to approach in terms of developing resiliency in your own gardens. It not only helps with water retention, but improved soil biology really benefits your plants as well, and they will grow better and give you far less problems over their lifetime and your lifetime in terms of growth and health. So anyway, we're going to get started into part 2 here and talk more about the irrigation aspects and plants themselves. So I'm going to do the irrigation portion of this first, and then I will move into how to find appropriate plant selections for your areas and talk about lawn substitutes in terms of getting, if you still want to have a lawn, there are some good choices that are non-cool season grasses. So here we go. Let's see. And I'm hoping, here we go. Oh, there we go. Okay. So again, I mentioned that last class we covered the California water story and soil. I started to delve in hydrozoning. I'm going to kind of go back over that a little bit with this class, and then we'll jump into irrigation. So they're on the page. So this presentation will be available following the class online through the El Dorado County Master Gardener website. And so you can find it there with the list of all of the resources. And I'm gonna, as well, and there's additional resources at the end of the presentation if you want to find more information on particular aspects of the presentation. Okay, so water conservation not only involves building your soils, but it also, and I also talked a bit about last class, removing and replacing your lawn. Lawns are ecological deserts. They promote the use, oftentimes most people use quite a few pesticides, herbicides, and other chemicals to maintain them, which are obviously not great for the environment, your children or pets. And then establishing hydrozone, using drought-tolerant plants, and we'll talk more about that. That fits right into the aspect of hydrozones and drip irrigation systems. So I'll cover a broader aspect of irrigation in total, but that's usually recommended. Oh, there we go. I'm gonna, okay, so I don't know why things are hanging up tonight. See, so anyway, so hydrozoning, just to recap, is the practice of clustering plants with similar water requirements together. You want to cluster plants as to, number one, their water needs, but also whether they require full sun, partial shade, or full shade. And then obviously you're going to have plants that are in the ground versus plants in pots. You don't want to water those. Those need to be irrigated separately. And then your vegetable gardens are a whole nother zone that should be separated in terms of irrigation from your regular landscaping. Veggie beds usually require far more water. This way you can manage your irrigation far more effectively and save water there. So showing this again, this is a planting design based on hydrozones. And in this case, there's pretty much just two. This is a very simple home where you can see that all the plants in blue are one hydrozone, and then the ones in front on green require a little more water, and that's another separate zone in itself. Now also, you would end up, if north was up, you would want to irrigate those on the east side of the house separately from those on the west side of the house. West side's going to get a lot hotter, a lot more sun exposure during the day than the east side. So those are the kind of concepts you want to be thinking about for hydrozoning. This is another diagram that we covered last week, but you can see where there's kind of a mixture of moderate, a little bit of high use. The high use in here is the vegetable garden, and then low water use plants. This approach makes it very difficult to get totally efficient with your irrigation, because you're going to have to water for the moderate water use plants in order to satisfy them. So then what happens is you're overwatering the low use water plants, or if you're watering for the low use, you're stressing out your moderate use plants. So where you can control this, and I'll talk a little bit about that, separating out again. So this is just a diagram of how logical separations in hydrozones should work and what you should attempt to do in terms of grouping the plants together so that you get more efficient watering. So in this particular case, this is probably, if you've got an existing home and an existing landscape, you may be looking at something like this where you've got just a total hodgepodge and mixture of various plants requiring different water uses. But you can kind of work with that in terms of drawing up and documenting what you've got. You may want need to move a few plants because it's going to be impossible unless you're willing to do that to get more efficient in your water use. You should always water, if you're watering all your shrub areas with your lawn, separate those zones. That's a pretty easy one to do. Mass plantings of perennials and ground covers should be separated out. As I mentioned, sun versus shade, east versus west, south versus north, those types of things. You can put east and north together oftentimes, and south and west together, because those are usually cooler, warmer. And then flat areas versus slopes. If you irrigate a slope like you do your flat areas, you're going to have a lot of water running off. Vice versa, if you're irrigating your slopes until the water's just starting to run off as you should, your flat areas are going to be too dry, most likely. So anyway, those are considerations. We also covered, and I'm just going to briefly, because WCALS is going to play into these ratings for high, low, and very low water usage, comes from a classification in California called WCALS, and it's the Water Use Classification of Landscape Species. This system is used by planning departments statewide now to review landscape plans for new developments and new homes that have to meet the requirements. And it's been developed by a whole cadre of landscape professionals, from academic to contractors and everything in between, nursery people and all the rest. But it's actually pretty easy to use for home gardeners. It's a very odd name, but so it provides information on 3,500 plants, different species, again, require different amounts of water, and that amount of water plays into the scheduling for irrigation systems. And this is something, so your water budget, the amount of water your plants actually, your landscape actually needs, is based on the weather and this plant factor that's provided by WUCOLs times the amount of area that you have. So that's why it's important to know what WUCOLs is if you're going to try to figure out and want to develop a schedule. So in this case, this is just an example for Citrus Heights. You can see how this works. So you can plug in your city, you can plug in a plant name. Now, if you don't know what your plants are, there's quite a few apps out there that you can take a photo with your smartphone, and it will come up. Most landscape plants are in the databases, so it'll tell you what it is, and you plug that in here, and then it will spit out all kinds of information, and it'll tell you whether it's high, low, or whatever. Now, in this case, we plugged in Nandina, and in this case, regular Nandina domestica, heavenly bamboo, the one that gets 6 to 8 feet tall, is a low water use plant. However, Nandina domestica purpurea, which is the dwarf variety, a much smaller variety, is actually a moderate to medium water user, which would have been a surprise to me, but it's something to know, and you might get those kinds of other surprises with other species. Okay, get it to go again. So you have to excuse me, sometimes it's not clicking over to the next page. We're taking it sweet. Okay, we're gonna, let's try that again. There we go. Okay. So another factor that plays in is into that calculation for schedules is weather. And that is measured by, they call it evapotranspiration rate, evapotranspiration, because weather affects how a plant is utilizing water in terms of both evaporation from the soil and then the transpiration that goes on with the metabolic process within the plant itself. So obviously we all know that the hotter the weather, the more water a plant is using. And as you get into the shoulder seasons of spring and fall, they're using less water. July is the hottest and the highest water use month in this part of the hemisphere, for the very reasons that it's the hottest time. Things affecting how much of that evapotranspiration goes on includes solar radiation, which is how much sunlight. Are we getting direct sun? Is it a cloudy day? Versus the temperature, relative humidity. Most in California here, you know, we're usually pretty low on the humidity. The wind speeds, when it's hot and windy, it is just sucking the water right out of the plants. And then soil exposure. If you don't have mulches down or some kind of cover over your soil in terms of ground covers, you're losing much more moisture to the environment than you would if you did have those. And then your planting density. Areas that are more densely planted are going to lose less water than those that are sparse and in between, where evaporation is taking place more between the plants. So back to the lawns a little bit. By acreage, lawns are the largest irrigated crop, surpassing corn even in the United States. And there are also ecological deserts. We talked about that before. I'm not going to beat that to death. There are ecological deserts with issues, fertilizers, pesticides, and the use of fossil fuels. So troubleshooting, and we went over this in terms of trying to, again, you can see where now there's starting to group plantings according to water use. And as you can do that, you can start to control your irrigation better. So when you're trying to troubleshoot an existing landscape, first you want to determine what that root cause classification is for each of your plants. You want to prioritize plants to save. And then especially remove any unhealthy or diseased plants. I mean, there's no use fighting that. You know, you might as well cut bait and run on those. And then remove lower priority plants from crowded areas. If your plants, if they're just overgrown or the wrong plant in the wrong place, you know, photinia in front of your windows, and especially you might want to really consider this for your fire safety, is that right now the new standards are that you shouldn't have any vegetation within 5 feet of your house, of your structure, especially not under your windows, because that's how fire it breaks. What happens is your plants become engulfed, they break the windows, and then it's, you know, pretty much all over at that point. So anyway, that's a consideration in talking about all of this, is that, okay, if the new standards are 5 feet away from the house, it's a good opportunity to remove some of those plants that really shouldn't be there anyway. Move and regroup plants according to their water needs. And then you might want to, at this point in time, decide that you want to have dedicate a whole area to drought tolerant or native plants at this point. And that'll reduce your water use as well. So we're going to move on into irrigation in terms of watering to keep plants healthy. So we talked a lot about soils last time. That was what most of the time was spent on, but we're going to just cover just a little bit and how that plays into irrigation. So you absolutely need to know your soil texture, and we'll see why. So test your soils, use the soil web app that I mentioned in the prior class. Do your percolation test to determine if your soils drain, how fast they drain, because if your soils don't drain well, you need to apply water very, very slowly to them. If you have sandy soils, it's a whole different application. So knowing that is key to you managing your water. So we talked about this before, determining your soil texture. Do you have sand, silt, or clay? Or do you have a loam, which is a mixture of all of those? You can do the soils test. You can look up the information on Soil Web, and it'll fall somewhere in this soil triangle, your texture. There's all different kinds of other names depending on the mixture of those three. So the reason that this is important, because sandy soils, unlike clays or silts, those particles don't hold together very well. They're very large in size compared to clay or silt. If you try to squeeze wet sand together, it just falls apart. Decomposed granite in our area it's not uncommon, and it's one of those that would be considered more sandy soils, because it's hard as a rock when it's dry, but as soon as it's wet and then you pick it up and you start to try to crumble it, it just falls apart. It requires more frequent watering and a higher amount of water to get an area covered and saturated. Silty soils, on the other hand, are finer, and I see that my internet connection is unstable. Hopefully it'll come back. But when they're dry, it can be readily broken, and it's easy to handle. Clay soils, on the other hand, are like I said, the particles are microscopic. There's a picture there in the lower right corner where if you grab a handful of it and squeeze it together, you get these ribbons that form. And clays require far less water and has to be applied much slower. Otherwise, what happens is it just oversaturates the soils and mostly runs off. And then you water less frequently as well because it just holds more water. Loams are this happy medium of equal parts sand, somewhat equal parts sand, silt, and clay. It can be ranging towards one or the other. They contain more nutrients. The fact that there's a mixture of particle sizes allows them to hold apart and allow for great infiltration of water and air. And they are easier to work than clay soils in general. So this is why it matters. This is why it matters. Is sandy soils, you can see that what happens with water is there's this long, narrow cone of how water penetrates the ground. And as opposed to clayey soils, the water spreads out more and penetrates more slowly, and so therefore the water gets more spread out and more uniform. Now, in talking about, so you want to match your whatever choice you use in terms of your irrigation application, whether you're using sprinkler heads or drip irrigation, you want to match it to your soil type. Thank you. If you have clay soils, you want something that really applies water slowly, as opposed to sandier soils. You can use those big sprinklers that put a lot of water on within the same time frame. As opposed to drip systems, again, you still need to pay attention. All drip systems are not equal. Drip emitters can range from a quarter gallon per hour to a gallon per hour. And so if you have sandy soils, you want to be applying a lot more water. You want to use emitters. If you used an emitter that has a quarter or a half gallon per hour on a sandy soil, you'll never get the areas of saturation to overlap like you want them to. So you need to be very careful about what you choose to use. And that's outlined here. You will find that all of this is also covered in all the manufacturers, whether it's Rainbird, Toro, Hardy, any of the irrigation manufacturers all have this in their catalogs. So they cover this well. So we're going to talk about the irrigation system components, because a functional, efficient irrigation system is necessary to be efficient with your water application. So this is an anatomy of an irrigation system in general. This is a standard irrigation system. You've got your water meter out at the street. You've got irrigation controllers. You've got remote control valves. Hopefully nobody has manual valves at this point in time. That's not trying to hand water is really inefficient, mainly because there's no way to measure how uniform you're applying your water, nor making sure everything gets the same amount of water equally. But there's all different kinds of sprinkler heads, or as in the lower right, drip irrigation systems. So talking about most of us, if you're on any kind of domestic water in this state, I think there's very few jurisdictions that at this point don't have water meters. You have a water meter out at the street. That's called your point of connection, or POC. This is where you can monitor for leaks once you shut everything down. And your standard meter size is 5/8 to 3/4 inch. Standard is usually 5/8. So that limits the amount of water you can use at any one point in time. You can't just put everything all on one valve and hope to have it be efficient. Nothing will work properly. And again, point of connection is just simply where everything connects, your irrigation connects to the service line. Pressure regulators are very important because there is nobody in city, even within a city, even within a irrigation or a water provider district, everybody's not going to have the same pressure. So knowing what a pressure regulator is and using it if necessary is important. Oftentimes, I mean, pressures can vary from 10 PSI, pounds per square inch, to 100. And it's oftentimes necessary to deal with these. Oftentimes there are pressure regulators already in the house so that your whole system inside your house is developing water hammer and you're not blowing up appliances. But you may need to use those as well with your irrigation system so that you're not blowing your irrigation systems up. Remote control valves are used to isolate areas, and then that controls the water going out to one particular zone, a hydrozone. So and the group of oftentimes valves are put together like you see here in the picture. There's 2 valves in one box. That's called a manifold. You want to put those somewhere where they're easy to get to, because you don't want to have to go finding them once they get buried by ground cover or mulch. I always recommend you keep them close to the edge of a walkway or a hardscape for accessibility. They can either be electrically fed in terms of their low voltage, or they also have battery operated ones. This is another time. This is very typical what you might see. You might have this at your home where you've got atmospheric vacuum breakers with your valves, and so you see them up out of the ground rather than a valve box. These are more prone to freezing, but the thing is that these must be 12 inches higher than the highest point in your valve system. So if your landscape goes up the hill from your home, this is not the way to go, and it should be changed out. Otherwise, what potentially happens is water can get sucked back into your domestic system and contaminate the water in your home. So also, irrigation controllers and sensors. The controllers these days are very smart, much like our phones. They can link into weather-based systems. Either you can have these kind of in the left-hand little quadrant right there. That's a home weather sensor or weather station. And so it tells the controller what the conditions are and will control your irrigation day by day, which is fabulous. Talk about water savings. That's about as good as you can get. There are moisture sensors as well that can go in the ground and speak back to your controller so that if things are wetter than they should be, it tells it not to come on. If it's been really hot and needs more water, it'll tell it to come on. So there are sensors for soil moisture. There are rain sensors that will shut off the controller, flow sensors that if it senses a leak, will shut the system down or have a valve not come on, and it'll tell you. If it senses too much wind, it'll delay the start times, so that, especially if you have sprinklers, when the wind is blowing, they're very inefficient and you're not going to get the coverage you intend. So, and then we've got the various devices that actually apply the water, so the sprinklers or the drippers. And overhead irrigation is best for turf and low-growing ground covers. It is by far less efficient than a drip system, mainly because you're losing water to the atmosphere, but plus the application itself, maximum with the best design system and the most efficient heads, is 75 to 80% efficiencies. And there are fixed spray heads that just pop up and they're already fixed. It's like a half circle, quarter circle, full circle. Those are fixed spray heads. Rotating sprinklers move the water, you see the stream change, and then rotors are like these fingers that come out, and they're not rotating, but it's just the way that it moves the water. So again, you need to select those types of sprinklers based on your soil, because you don't want to be applying more water than your soil can handle, and vice versa. You need to apply enough water that you're actually getting coverage around your plants and in your root zone for healthy plants. Now, fixed spray sprinklers, this is just a little more detail. Apply a fan of water, and they can range from a radius of 2 to 17 feet. Applying water at an application rate of up to 2 inches or more per minute. And this exceeds the infiltration rate of most soils. So what you end up doing is you have to schedule so that it comes on for, say, 10 minutes, then it goes off for a couple hours, you apply it for 10 minutes more. And so, you know, as long as you've got a controller to control that, it is feasible to utilize this. And your typical operating pressure is roughly 30 psi. Most people have that at their homes. If you don't, then you need especially not to use something like this. 6-inch pop-ups are recommended for turf, mainly so that even if your grass gets high, it's not deflected. It's getting up above the grass to be able to apply water evenly. A good head has a built-in check valve to prevent low head drainage, because when these systems go off, it ends up draining out the low head. So as long as they have these built-in check valves, then you're not losing that water. It's just trapped in the pipes, and next time the system comes on, it's utilizing that water instead of just losing it to low drainage. Pressure regulation is very important. I talked about pressure regulators earlier. If you have too much pressure, what happens is your head's mist, and so you get very little water actually falling to the ground and irrigating. It's just lost to the wind and evaporating off. You want to be using sprinkler heads that have matched precipitation rate nozzles, and that's all explained in the various manufacturers' catalogs. And then using the appropriate arc or type of head. If it's a half head along an edge, or a 3/4, 1/4, whatever, using the appropriate pattern. And so they do have high efficiency nozzles, and they can improve your distribution of uniformity, and we'll talk about that. So these rotating sprinklers are for a little bit bigger systems. They range from 6 to 35 feet in radius. They're a little more wind resistant. So these are for a larger lawn or ground cover area. Their operating pressure can range in there from 35 to 55 psi. So you've got to have that available. In fact, you have to have more than that available, because you got to take into account pressure loss along the way. And oftentimes the bodies are the same, and you can change out nozzles if you want to change your whole system out to a more efficient system. If you can accommodate this within your system, you can use these. You can retrofit the heads you have. And then rotors. These are for big lawn areas or large ground cover areas. And again, you can see these go up to 15 gallons a minute. Again, they have matched precipitation rate nozzles. Operating pressures here required anywhere from 20 to 100 psi. You might, for instance, use something like this in a pasture or a very large lawn. And then the impact type in the very lower left-hand corner there, the old rainbird impacts. Those are very inefficient type heads to use. So you should move away from those if you're trying to increase your efficiency. So here's a great example of an inefficient fixed spray system. It's just water. You can see it's misting. There's water all over the sidewalks. That is not what anybody's looking for at this day and age in terms of efficiency. This is a far more efficient solution if this is the type of landscape you have. I would suggest that even something like this, just go with a dripper line system. A lot of people have this already, top-ups. Those are pretty difficult to actually install. You've got to have the capability to install that deep. This is an example of poor sprinkler coverage, and this is oftentimes what a lot of people are dealing with in their lawns, and why irrigating lawns can be so frustrating, because what ends up happening is that most people are over irrigating to get this brown patch green, and meanwhile what that means is all the rest of it's getting way more water than it needs. So very inefficient. As opposed to, this is a good example of good sprinkler coverage. Everything's uniform, everything's green. So drip irrigation applies water to single spots or spots along a pipe. And this is suitable for irrigating almost anything that's non-turf. Now, there are dripper line systems that are made for turf. Those are, I've never used them personally, and I've been specifying drip line systems for nearly 40 years. So it's still something that, even though they make it maybe not the best way to go. There is very little water loss to evaporation, absolutely no runoff, overspray, or wind drift associated with drip systems. The application rate is variable and should be, the type of system you use should be dependent on your soil, but you should never be mixing one type of drip device with another. Oftentimes you'll see drip emitters and those drip sprayers, and you'll see micro tubing over here, and that's making for a very inefficient system as well. So try to keep all of those uses separate. Don't mix them up. And you may need filters and pressure regulators with these as well. Now, most of these systems these days will operate at normal house pressure, somewhere in the 30 to 50 PSI range. So that's great news, because then you don't, but the filters, oftentimes, you always want to have a drip filter on with each of your valves, that then you take apart and flush once or twice a year, depending on the particulate matter that might be in your domestic water, but it is something that still should be done. So there are two types of drip systems. You got point source, and that's where you simply put your emitters in the pipe at the plant. And those should be used for very, very sparse plantings, or what we call line source, or we call it drip line is the other terminology that we use for this. The actual emitters are welded inside the pipe at regular intervals. And so you have a drip line that you see regular holes in it, but there's actually a very intricate emitter inside that controlling the water application. It's not just holes in the pipe. You can see here, there's little swellings on the pipe where the emitters are. That's because there's elaborate emitters inside each of those. So usually emitter spacings are ranging from 6, 12, 18, or 24-inch spacings. Generally, if you were going to be in a sandy soil, you would need to use something on the order of a 6-inch spacing. If you're in clay, loam soils, 12-inch spacing, and your clay soils, you're going to be using 18 inches or 24-inch. And again, the flow rates vary widely from a quarter, there's usually quarter, half gallon, and 1 gallon per hour. So again, that's determined, what you're going to use is determined by your soils. And then there's a grid, and I'll show you what this looks like. I'll put down. So again, with dripper line too, you don't want to be adding other types of drip emitters. You don't want to be using those little dripper sprays. You want to use strictly drip line. And I always recommend that if you're going to use drip line, use the pressure compensating, with pressure compensating emitters in it. It keeps the flow even throughout the whole system. And don't exceed the maximum line runs that are recommended by the manufacturer. Those are all called out in the tables that are provided by them. And you should utilize flush valves at the low points in the system and air vacuum relief valves at the high points. And we'll look at that. So just in general, when you're looking at sandy versus loamy versus clay, this is how water moves in each of the soils. You can see how different it is. And it's important to get the emitters right for your soil. Here you can see how that changes. You've got your different emitters flows. They even put the soil type right there for you. So you can cue into that and go, okay, I know what I'm supposed to use. And then depending, you know, how loamy, how clay, how sandy, etc., you can have some room to play there in terms of the spacing of those lines apart. And okay, so this is what a system's going to look like installed. You've got the emitters are spaced along those lines. I'm just going to say, for instance, 12 inches apart. That's what I'm using on my soils. I've got silty loams. And then you space your lines 12 inches apart. So what you've got are an emitter system where every 12 inches, there's an emitter. So you're getting a nice even application of water with that. This is a great picture because I personally find it a lot easier to plant my plants first and then put my dripper line system down right after you get everything planted and raked out, because with this, you're kind of working around and having to try to work your soil back into the holes and working around all the drip pipe. But this gives you a better idea of what that actually looks like in terms of plants versus the laid down dripper line system. It's pretty easy to convert from sprinklers to drip lines. I've done it at my other home where I decided to remove the lawn and put in drought tolerant ornamental grasses and that, and a few other low growing ground covers. And so what I did was plugged off all the heads, capped them all off, and just used one of those heads closest to the valve and connected the dripper line system in just like you see here and ran that out. So once you get your planting done, then you bring in your mulch and put it over the top of the dripper line so you don't see it. When you start to see your dripper line showing again, that means you need more mulch. It's a good way to be reminded to do that. So one of the problems with point source dripping, that's where you go in and put the emitters at each individual plant, you can see how you're getting a very, very uneven application of water. This is not going to promote a good root system in plants that go out and utilize water all over. This is not the way rain falls or a spray system works either. So you will have more stressed out plants or plants that tend to stay smaller. And maybe that's okay if you really have a limited water source. This might be a way to go. But I always recommend that if you're going to use a drip source like that, that you put at least 4 emitters around any one plant. That gives it at least a better chance. And you don't put the emitters right at the base of the plant itself. You put them to the edge of the the plant itself as it goes into the hole. And you should be supplementing water during an establishment period to help it until it starts reaching out. But by putting 4 emitters, you'll get the roots starting to spread out from that point, as opposed to if you just keep watering that like it's a planted pot on your deck, the roots don't get the encouragement or have the water resources to move on out from that point. So this is the home I mentioned where I took out the lawn there. This drip light system has been in for 30 years. I had to look at my husband and think how long we've been together. So put that in back then. Everything is still going gangbusters at this home. And like I said, it was really easy to convert the sprinkler systems to a drip system there. So I can vouch for the fact that these systems will last a very long time. So this is what the point source drippers look like. You probably are all familiar with these. Not something I've ever been a fan of, primarily because often it's very frustrating to go see projects that have been on the ground for a long time and half the drippers are missing. Whether rodents take them off, they get kicked off, maintenance-wise, not maintained properly. These are just far more prone to not working properly than a dripper line system. And this is, again, this is what you see. So these emitters get kicked off their stick, you know, their stands, whether it's by animals, kids, somebody running through it, then the emitter's no longer at the plant where you want it. So anyway, I'm not a fan. Then you've got bubblers and microsprays, and there are places for those, especially if you have an isolated area where you've got, say, a long row of a particular planting and isolated areas. Sometimes a bubbler or a microspray might be an appropriate system to use. I still would suggest using dripper line in a spiral as opposed to using these. Again, because of more efficiency. You can see with the sprays and water misting up, those can get blocked. They're not going to be as efficient as it dripping right into the soils around your plants. Soaker hose and laser tubing are absolutely not recommended. The flow rates are not uniform. You get far more water coming out at the beginning than the end. So just steer clear of those altogether. So the water efficiency features with irrigation systems, I mentioned before, match precipitation features. You don't want one sprinkler putting out 3 times the water than another sprinkler on the same system. Everything should be putting out the same amount of water per the area. And so that's what they mean by matched precipitation. So you want to be utilizing that kind of equipment. Check valves keep your lines from draining. So it sort of traps the water in the pipe, in the irrigation pipe, rather than just losing it. So I mentioned that before, that when the system comes back on, that water's already in the pipe and charges it and utilizes it. Pressure regulators compensate for high or fluctuating pressure. So you don't want too high a pressure even in dripper line systems, because it'll make things just not operate properly. Move my bar here. And then the pressure compensating emitters, if you were to use dripper line, ensure that you do get an even flow. Here we go again, a little delay in the response time. Not sure why I'm getting hiccups in the system tonight. I think that's just the way. Okay, come on. Afraid if I hit it too many times, I'm going to go flying through all the slides. Oh, there we go. Okay, so I'm just going to go back just to make sure I didn't go past. Okay, so distribution uniformity is a term that it has to do with how evenly water is applied by a sprinkler in particular, and then the spacing of those sprinklers. What's really challenging and why sprinklers are not efficient is simply because it is very difficult to get a sprinkler to apply water out uniformly, number one. And then secondly, the spacing between these, you just never can get it, even though you generally want what's called head-to-head coverage, where the water from one sprinkler touches the head of the next sprinkler so that you have complete overlap. That's where you get the best uniformity, but it's still not 100%. Matter of fact, it's at best 82%. Standard is 63%. So and whereas drip systems are more in the order closer to 90% than 80%, especially if you're using pressure compensating. You have far more control over where that water's going. So irrigation practices to avoid. We've talked about how important operating pressure is, because if you don't have enough or you have too much, your system is not going to operate as it's designed to do. And so you're going to wind up with problems. One of the biggest things you see with sprinkler systems are unmatched precipitation rates, and particularly because sure enough, you'll have that nozzle that goes out and needs replacing, and you run down to the store, you don't remember what you've had, or husband picks up another nozzle, or your maintenance person has got a whole truck full of them and just sticks on whatever works in order to make the system work again. So what you end up with over a 20-year period is a system where almost nothing matches anymore. So it becomes less efficient with time than it was originally installed. And then mixing up types of emission devices, again, don't do it because it just leads to more inefficiency. Stay away, avoid soaker hoses and laser tubing. If you're going to have a sprinkler system, invariably you're going to have plant materials blocking the overhead sprays. And then don't put the drip emitters at the base or the stems of your plants, whether they're trees or shrubs or ground cover. Keep those a bit away from that so that you don't wind up with crown rot. In terms of, if you already have an irrigation system, you need to regularly maintain it and just check out how the system is functioning. So you wanna go check your irrigation controller. Now the smart controllers, pretty much all you need to do is change the battery backup once a year, because a lot of these you can actually operate with your smartphone these days. I'm so thankful for those kinds of things. But you want to make sure that the date and time are reset if needed for the older controllers. If you've had power outages and you didn't have your battery backup, you may need to reset everything. So make it just like your home monoxide, or the fire alerts and carbon, whatever they are, we change our batteries at least once a year. You should do it for your controllers as well, so that you don't lose your programming. Unless you have it all written down, it's a challenge to do that again. So in doing an irrigation system checkup, here's a whole list of things that you want to check so that you avoid issues like you see right here in the various pictures. You don't want blowouts on your valves and your heads. Oftentimes, it's not, we've all seen it happen. You drive down the road, and especially with commercial properties. It seems like those are the ones that, you know, in the middle of a rainstorm, you see blown out heads with a fountain on them. Make sure that's not going on at your own home. So you want to make sure to fix your problems. If you've got stuck valves, the thing is you want to take off the bonnets on your valves and flush them out on a regular period, or have your maintenance person do that. Readjust any arcs on your nozzles, unclog your nozzles. So just a whole array of things here that you want to do to keep your system working as efficiently as possible. Prune or move plants that are blocking the sprays. The last thing you want to do is be moving the heads, because then you're messing with the whole design of the system again. But invariably, you're going to get plants blocking if you're using spray systems in a standard landscape area. It's one of the reasons I just refuse to design them. If this is what low pressure looks like, for instance, on the top, what will happen is if your pressure is too low for a particular type of sprinkler, you get this trickle effect rather than a spray pattern. On the other hand, if your pressure is too high, it just looks like it's misting. And so that's not applying water efficiently either. So again, you need to either, if your pressure is too low for a particular type of head, you need to change them out to something that will work with what you do have. High pressure, you can simply add a pressure regulator to your system and should be able to get that under control. Other things happen when you have excessive water pressure as well. You'll get water hammer, which causes your pipes to bang. And it's not just that, is what what happens is that continuous beats on the pipe and it wears down splitting, and it will reduce the life of your system if you have that going on. So again, if you've got high pressure, it's easy to put on a pressure reducer and reduce that down to avoid hammer. Scrubbing is when you've got too high a water velocity inside the pipe. So you need to change that on the other end to reduce the amount of water flowing through a system. And again, it'll wear away the pipe and just wear the system down and then blow out on you when you least expect it, of course. Whoop, there we go. Oh, I think I redid that slide, so that one needs to disappear. How do you know whether or not you've got too high a pressure? It's pretty easy to, to measure your water pressure at a hose bib on your home and get some idea of what your system has. And if you're going to be installing something new, you absolutely need to know what that is. If you ignore the whole water pressure aspect of designing a system, you will pay for it down the road. So know what you've got and measure it. So let's see. Yeah, so there's a number of ways, and you can see that this is the device you would use to actually measure your water pressure in order to determine whether it's high, low, or somewhere in between. It's easy to check drip pressure as well. You want to know that you've got enough pressure to run your system, and you also want to know that you don't have too much, so that too much water is actually coming out and breaking down your emitters as well. This is what a pressure regulator looks like, and again, most of us have them on homes, especially within municipalities. They're usually set at 50 to 65 psi, and that's generally because your municipal systems have much higher pressure so they don't, you know, if you didn't have that on, what ends up happening is you get water hammer all through the house, and especially the last thing you want are pipes breaking in your home. And then you tee off before the water line gets to your home is where you want to tee off for irrigation systems. So when you measure water pressure with a gauge, you want to take the static pressure with no water moving. You turn everything off in the home that would possibly be running. Make sure there's no washing machines, dishwashers, etc. Working at the time. Attach your gauge, turn it on the valve, and then read your pressure. It's really pretty simple. So flow is the companion to water pressure, and you need to know what that is too, because you need to know how much water you have to work with. Again, the 5/8 inch meter that most of us have, if you're in a city or a municipal water system, we're way out in the country, but we have domestic water as well as a well. Our domestic water meter, a 1/10 of a mile down the driveway, is a 5/8 inch meter. So that limits me to the amount of water that meter can provide. So knowing that, so you end up having to create more valve systems based on that. Whereas with my well, I've got somewhere in the order of 25 gallons a minute. I've got half of that with my meter. You know, it'll determine how I valve my system. So anyway, you need to know all of this, and you need to know the size of the lines coming in as well from your water meter. Oftentimes it'll only be a 3/4 inch line. So sometimes you may need to go back to your meter and actually upsize, because the water meter doesn't necessarily determine the size of the line that needs to go to your home or to your irrigation system. I know this sounds, a lot of this is probably you're going, oh my God, there's so much, it's so confusing. And it is. It's not easy to know this stuff. But what I hope to do here is just with this brief overview, you'll have some idea of what to look at in your own systems, and then, you know, whether you decide to go further and try to utilize this. There's classes, a lot of different, I know our master gardener through El Dorado County offers irrigation classes where you can learn to design your own systems. So there's other places, but this gives you an idea of what you need to do or what's involved in getting an efficient irrigation system for your needs. So anyway, so back to it. You need to determine what your maximum available gallons per minute is that you can use based on your meter size and the line size coming in. And then you need to calculate how you use that water. So your water budget for your actual plants. So we talked about evapotranspiration rates, and these are all measured by these. There's stations out there. You don't have to try to determine what that is. There are stations out there called CMIS stations that get all this data, and so you can go online and find a source for that closest to where you live. There's CMIS maps in this case to show the whole Sacramento region. There are CMIS stations at various locations indicated by the purple buttons. You can look at those. A lot of the weather apps these days have stations in your own area. I know, like Weather Underground, for instance, there's a station that is a mile away from me in my area that will give me all the data I need, and it's going to be far more accurate than me trying to base something on weather or what the stations are doing over in Auburn. That's not going to be quite as applicable to me. So just knowing that these weather stations are out there and that generally you have access to them by either going online or using an app makes it a lot easier. And smart controllers can be tied right into these. You can either get little mini weather stations to go with your system, or you can tie into these existing weather stations. If you have an irrigation system already, you can conduct audits to determine how efficient your system already is and whether there's things that you need to tweak and change in order to make it more efficient. So in terms of some conservation strategies for irrigation, water at night or the early morning. And early morning is always best. Watering at night can be problematic in terms of spreading disease or making things more moist in terms of molds and fungi kind of spreading. So it's always usually better to water in the early morning versus night. Don't water when it's windy. Now you can with dripper line systems because you're applying the water right there at the ground, and it should be under a layer of mulch anyway, so you're not losing any water, so wind doesn't matter in that case. You want to avoid and reduce overspray if you're using sprinklers. You want to water less frequently but more deeply in order to encourage deep rooting systems. When you water, a lot of people do, they just feel a need to water lawns every day. And what that does is it develops a very shallow rooted system, and the roots never feel a need to get down. When I did have a lawn, I watered twice a week for 20 minutes, and I could go 2 weeks without watering at times and still not. It was still green. I never had a brown lawn. But I also had good soils and took a lot of time to get my soils right before I ever planted. So anyway, watering deeply. And then once you establish a schedule, you can gradually reduce that application about 10% at a time and see how everything is reacting. Because even the best, all the calculations that we do and all of this that we go through to establish a schedule is based on an industry system of growing turf. So no matter what, the schedules that even the professionals develop are still probably higher than what's really needed. So you can take those schedules and start reducing and see at which point you're going, I don't like that, the way things are looking anymore. I want to add a little more water back. Or this is where I want to hold the line. But so don't be afraid to reduce a little bit and see how your landscape reacts. And then managing irrigation to match your microclimates. Do you have any really low areas or areas that are really hot and exposed, especially this time of year? I know I've got areas on the west side of my house that I need to go out and do a little supplemental hand watering just to kind of get through this 1 month of the year. But the whole idea is to encourage a deep, extensive root system because that is resilient. So I'm going to talk a little bit about capture and utilizing, especially storm water. And there are irrigation alternatives to using municipal drinking water that comes out of your water meter. So by catching rainwater or utilizing gray water, and even if you have a large air conditioner, you can utilize that condensate a bit. That'll help save. Rainwater harvesting can range from utilizing rain barrels, larger cisterns, or very large underground tanks or even above ground tanks. Frankly, in our part of California, I wouldn't even waste my time with the barrels unless you just have no other options. I actually run my system in and utilize it in a bog garden, but there are other types of systems that, given the amount of water our landscapes need during the summer, when we have no more water coming in, I mean, 1 rain barrel full after our last rain isn't going to get you very far. It might get you to watering the plants on your deck. So think about how you might utilize that and whether it's really useful to you. So one of the big permaculture concepts is to capture water, slow it, spread it, sink it. You want to try to maintain as much of the rainwater as possible on your own land, and not in a pond, but to sink it into the soil so that it's holding more water in the soil itself. And to let it percolate. What you don't want is water just running off and down, down into the creeks. It will do that anyway once it reaches a certain capacity, but you do want to capture and sink as much as possible. So a rain garden is the equivalent of a home bioretention basin. You're seeing bioretention basins utilized in shopping centers and public projects more and more, because now they're not just sending it down storm drains, they're trying to capture it on site. And these really plants, they have found that the plants and the microorganisms in the soil will break down the pollutants and help reduce all of that waste going into creeks and downriver and then out to the ocean. So collecting water from your high points and moving it down to depressions on your own property and then allowing it to sink in where possible is a great way to help your own the soil, the moisture capacity in your soil. So this is what kind of a rain garden looks like, and this is, to me, this is sort of how I'm building my bog garden. It's an area that I over excavated. And I did put in a pond liner because I had it available, and then poked holes in it with a pitchfork because I really wanted a bog garden as opposed to just not having the liner in there. But you can plant specialty plants in there that you wouldn't normally be able to grow, some special kinds of grasses and that. It provides great habitat for insects and birds. You can grow some different kinds of trees like box elders and things that require a little more water than normal with this kind of application. It adds a unique landscape feature in the landscape. I think it's got some photos here. This is, for instance, now this is a rain garden under construction. You excavate a low area and then bring in more gravel plants, but you can see how water would settle into this during a rainy time. And then when it's not raining, it still looks, it almost looks like a dry creek bed. So that can be a nice, unique feature. You want to make sure, if you're going to do a rain garden, that you keep it at least 10 feet away from structures. You don't want to be encouraging issues with your foundation. I would probably put it at least 20 feet away, but keeping it away from your property line so that it doesn't affect your neighbors. And then if you have a high water table, you need to be mindful of that and not locate it there either. But I think I've got some photos of what. So also the other way to deal with sinking in the water is to utilize swales. These capture and look like natural waterways. In some respects, you can even put stepping stones through these and use them like a walkway. But the swales allow you to capture, slow, and sink the water in, and then planting along those edges, you've got usually a lot more moisture in those areas for a lot longer before things start drying out. So this can look really nice. I really enjoy seeing these in landscapes. So there are two kinds of swale systems: the vegetated swales, where you plant grasses right in them, and those are called bioswales, or the rock-lined or the dry creek bed look. Now here's another type of underground rainwater storage. Now this one is a lot more serious in terms of it's got more capacity to be able to actually store water that can be used for some time and maybe for special uses, where you actually build it in underground. And if you think about, say, if you've ever seen the pondless waterfalls, this would be similar to those systems where you've got an underground storage. They look like milk crates and water's in there, but they're very sturdy. You can put stuff on top of them. Some of them are even rated for traffic. You can drive on them. And those will store a lot of water, which you can then draw out and utilize for irrigation systems. I know at one point I had considered doing something like this under a carport we're building, and I figured the size of that carport and doing all the calculations, I could store a year's worth of water into rainwater underneath that footprint if I were to do something like this. And so if water sources ever get really bad, this would be a way to go. So this is what one of those would look like, you know. And this one, you're going to see, this is a contractor down in Southern California that I know who did this in a backyard and then put a patio over that. I mean, that's a lot of storage, water storage capacity under that patio. So again, rainwater collection, whether you do it underground, this is the typical, you know, approach, is using a rain barrel or even a large 600 gallons, at least give you a little more capacity, but it's something to consider. So gray water systems are legal in this state. Each county has, I believe, might have its own criteria. You need to make sure that you meet the requirements of your county, but it allows you to bypass and to utilize water coming out of your washing machines and I believe showers. Let's see. Yep, sinks, showers, and laundry water. But you can't. Okay, so you can see in the upper right, you've got the hose coming out and it comes into a valve box. You cannot, the one constraint with using gray water is you cannot run it out and just daylight it onto the ground. It has to come out into a valve box like is shown in the lower left-hand corner. And that has to do with any perceived contamination. This way you make sure that it's not contaminating anything. But so this is, I know quite a few people who have put these into their, are utilizing these at home. So it's something to consider. It beats catching it out of the shower and having to take buckets out and go from there. So Gray Water Action is an organization in the Bay Area who have helped forward the whole California gray water regulations. And they've got a great website if you want to know more about doing gray water systems. One of our own master gardeners, Alice Cantelo, teaches a class, a much more involved class on the use of gray water and stormwater. So watch for her class. So permeable paving is another aspect of capturing water. When you have permeable pavement, again, it allows water to slow it and sink it, as opposed to hard surfaces where it just runs off and then you can't capture it or utilize it in any way. So using interlocking pavers is a great way. Water that's coming down into a paving system that's not solid, all that water is going down into your own water table and throughout. In my landscape, that would mean it's getting utilized by the oak trees and other plantings in the yard. And in this case, they do have a drain utilizing, so you can run that off into another storage, or you can just run it out to another area that would benefit from that water. So we're going to talk about plants now. I know this is probably what most of you have been waiting for, and what plants where. And so what I'm going to do is, because there are people here from I believe all parts of California possibly, but at least our area, we all have different requirements. And so trying to give you specifics can be very challenging. But water-wise landscapes don't have to look like, I know we used the term xeriscape for a long time, and of course everybody started calling them xeriscapes. And that's not the goal, nor does it have to look like that. I've got plants out in one on the west side of my house that don't get but 1 or 2 waterings in the summertime that are still flowering. Fremontodendron, a salvia, Medalia poppies, those kinds of things. But this is a good for instance, especially the one without the lawn, but if you want lawn, you still can plant water resistant plants in the areas around that. And you can see that there's both of these would be great pollinator gardens. So the high priority in any landscape are your trees and shrubs. So if you have great big existing trees, try to leave those alone unless they're all in declining health. Your medium priority are any perennials, fruit and nut trees, and then low priorities would be your annuals and flower beds. And so prioritize what the value of those trees. It's much harder to replace trees than it is a bunch of annuals. Okay, going back to compost. Use compost and mulch to increase the water holding capacity of your soils. I hadn't beaten that into your head last time. Here's my more opportunity. Modify your irrigation to do it less frequently but longer to get that, if you're not in sandy soils, to really encourage the rooting to go deeply. Consider removing or replacing plants that show stress if you do cut water back. Just a consideration. And then don't fertilize during the summer, because what that does, fertilization just encourages, besides being bad for the soil, it encourages the growth to speed up. And when the growth speeds up, you're utilizing more water. Summertime is when plants are more stressed, so you don't want to encourage active growth at that point in time. You want to go ahead and just let it sort of meander through the hot time and just be laid back. And right plant, right place. Make sure you're planting plants in full sun that can take it. Don't plant sun-loving materials in the shade. I mean, just look at the requirements and the cultural requirements of the things you really enjoy and put them in the most appropriate place. There's a great resource, Rescape. I think if you go to rescape.org, has a couple of different generic landscape design plans as ideas to look at. They're all water resilient plans that were developed to be examples of what any homeowner can do. And so you can take a look at these various landscape plans and then perhaps pick and choose, but it'll give you a good general idea of plant material and placement given the orientation and the sun and the shade and that with some of these plants. This is one of them, and has absolutely no lawn, but you can see there's lots of color. Hardly looks like a xeriscape, so to speak. Doesn't look like a cactus garden. And we're gonna freeze up again. So, there we go. So they provide, besides a schematic, they actually provide detail, planting plans that you can see here. So it gives you this is really great for providing some ideas. So there's this one. there. This is number 2. You can see a whole nother layout with walkways. Again, the planting plan. So these are a great resource for those of you looking for ideas. A whole residence. This is much larger scale in terms of, and a fancier landscape plan with patios, etc. One in a cul-de-sac. So a lot of variety here in terms of ideas. Now for plant materials, one of the resources that I really urge people to go to is CalFlora has an aspect to their, if you go to calflora.org, there's, you can pick then select what grows here. And from that, you can see that you can enter in your location and in terms of by city or zip code, you can try zip code. And then you can select from water tolerant, low water tolerant, riparian shade, etc. And it gives you a whole list of various types of plants from which then you can select those and go through and see what you like. You can look at photos of those plants and decide what works for you. It's a great resource. And those are going to be mostly native plants that they get recommended there. So they'll be specific to your area. Here's once, for instance, this is clicked on, I believe the perennials, or no, this is trees. No, acacia, yeah, or perennials. So anyway, once you click on one of those categories, you can see where it starts to go down and it shows you photographs, and then you click on those and it'll tell you more about the plant themselves. And it'll show you where those plants grow naturally. So depending on how true or purist, how much of a purist you want to be in terms of growing plants that are endemic to your area or not, or other places, you can make those choices. So another great site is the calscape.org. And if you go to their page and then click on advanced search there in the upper right corner, you can enter your specific address in on the line there. And then what you will get is it will take you to this page. The next page it'll take you. You can start making selections here of a lot more aspects in terms of what your needs are. You can see that, you know, I can choose to find a shrub that'll grow in full sun, in medium draining soil that has a very low water requirement, that's moderately easy to maintain, and etc. You can make all these choices. The more choices you have, the less, just remember this, the more choices you make in here, the less that will come up in terms of meeting your criteria. So you might want to pick just a couple of them and then go from there to see what comes up for your specific location. And these are more of the, so it even goes to fragrance and flower color and the height. You can specify a height. So, and then turf alternatives. So right now, pretty much what everybody has is either a warm season grass or cool season grasses, mostly cool season grasses in this area, but those are the least water efficient selections in terms of turf. There are a number of grasses that are more, you can see on this in terms of water conservation strategies, in terms of the amount. The warm season turf grasses are more water efficient, but they also don't look as good throughout the year as the cool season turf grasses do for us. You typically want to mow higher and not lower with grasses. That saves water, and not mowing when it's very hot. That will help save water if you're intent on keeping grasses. But there are great alternatives. So a number of the local, I say local, Delta bluegrass is in the Delta quite literally, but they're well known in Northern California as a turf supplier, grower and supplier, and they do a lot of experimenting. So they have developed a number of mixes that are far more drought tolerant, and including using some native grasses to develop mixes that will be more water resilient. So this, like on the right hand side, the Agrostis palens is a native bent grass lawn. So that is, you know, at least it's a native grass and doesn't require as much of anything. It doesn't require as many pesticides, herbicides. Hopefully none of that will be needed. I hear somebody's, make sure to mute, if you've just come on, make sure to mute your self, please. Okay, other alternatives. So this is the natural habit for Calaria macrantha. And you can see, though, it can make for a good lawn as well. So there are some of the natural grasses that you may not think of in terms of utilizing them. And then red fescue, Festuca rubra. And what I really like about this, I really like the looks of that longer, kind of windswept look of a lawn. Some may really not care for that at all. But you can see it can be mown, or it can be left more natural, in which case it provides a little more habitat, and also doesn't require near the maintenance nor anything else. These are both don't need much in the way of fertilizers, pesticides, anything like that to keep them healthy. This is another good substitute, Carex panza, in its natural state as a clumping grass. Now mown, it's still going to be clumpier. It's not something that you're going to want to play football on or a volleyball or something, you know, could be an ankle, but it's a good place that if you're mostly concerned about having grass for your pets, this would be a good solution. And, you know, if you let it go a little longer sometimes of the year and don't pay attention to it, it's still going to have that real natural look to it. For slopes, there's a number of the festucas, the fescues, that can look really nice on slopes. Now, this can be, as long as you don't let them go dry, they can keep things a little more fire resistant as well. You can see how nice those do look in terms of compared to each other. And we are at the end. So there's a couple of pages of resources here for you to take a look at for water storage, lawn alternatives, etc. And should you have other questions, we'll go into a Q&A right now. You can always reach us at our Master Gardener office. Now, I don't know how that's working right now, but we do have a Facebook page. So, but you can't actually ask questions on it, I don't believe. But anyway, so from there, Mary, are you going to be back on?
I'm here, and okay. Several questions already pending. What we'd like to do, though, at this point, if you don't have any questions, or you're not interested in hearing the response to the questions that are entered already on chat, feel free to leave the meeting. We're going to stop the recording at this point. And Kit, if you're ready, we can get started on some.
Okay.
The first one, let me get back to it.